Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about kind of the two things that you might play on your Kruspe horn, and sort of two things that go well with sort of in-between horns. So not quite Kruspe, not quite Geyer. They're both G series. So first we're going to start with the LA, which is the sort of like very purpose-built Con 8D vintage Elkhart mouthpiece. And so we've got one here. This is obviously not a vintage Con 8D. This is a Con 6D from the 1930s. It's got a relatively large bell for a Geyer adjacent horn. It's got a Patterson lead pipe. Patterson obviously famous for making a very nice Kruspe model and has some of those influences in the tapers. So yeah, this plays sort of in that in-between, like a large belled Geyer. So, the LA is an efficient mouthpiece at making the 8D, the vintage Elkhart 8D play a certain way. It's not quite the right mouthpiece for this horn, but it'll give you an idea of the difference between it and some of the other ones. And then so you'll have to shift where it is. This is like a very, very responsive horn. And I have a GM just as a benchmark comparison that we can put at the end. But without further ado, let's start with the LA. So as you can see, it's kind of got that very smooth studio character. If your horn is a Hoyer, like one of the Hoyer Heritage series, a vintage Elkhart, something that plays in that vein, this could be a really good mouthpiece for your horn. We'll move on to the C series. The CV is our new sort of general purpose mouthpiece. We think this works great on a lot of horns, 8Ds included. This has been our newest model. It was launched for IHS this year. We got to test it on pretty much everything, and we were just blown away at how widely it worked. It worked on everything from the new 8Ds and, the new Hoyers and the new Yamahas, the Kruspe style, all the way to a Berg. It works well in my original Geyer. Pretty much a very broad spectrum of horns. So we'll hear how it sounds on the 6D, and you can compare it kind of directly to the LA. So the first thing that jumps out is it's a much denser sound than the LA. It still has that big glow that you're looking for in kind of a Kruspe mouthpiece, but it also, that glow works nicely on other horns. And it doesn't lack central density. So we get a really nice core to the sound, a pretty large color change. This design works really well on just like a very wide spectrum of horns. It's one of the, big advantages in our opinion of the model. Next up we have its close cousin. This is the GH. So this is meant for Geyer horns. It's got a little more mass to it than the CV. And it's sort of designed to give you that kind of open feel, to go with the very open wrap of the Geyers without feeling like it takes in, all of your air. It has probably the biggest color change from quiet to loud of any mouthpiece we makes. And it's a little bit more kind of direct than the CV, but not it feels more in the G family. It feels a little bit tighter and brighter, but not overwhelmingly so. They're not really that different in design, but you will hear a pretty big sound difference. So maybe a little less, more of a color change, right? Like a little less core pianissimo and a brighter fortissimo. And then kind of the last thing you might think about playing on your Kruspe or your kind of in-between horn or even your Geyer is the GC. This is sort of our vintage take on like a vintage Giardinelli or a vintage Bach or something like that. And, we have a whole nother video about the design of this mouthpiece, comparing it directly to those. But for this context, I just want to give you this as something that kind of plays in this realm of things that you might want on a horn like this. Then one last point of comparison, which is actually the GM. And this is sort of just, this has developed a reputation as just being a very elegant player. Very controlled mouthpiece, a little bit of a deeper cut than the G. It also works nicely on this horn. And I just want to give you a sense of how that compares to, say, the GH or the GC. And that's, so, the GM has a very good control of the instrument. You can really throttle back in the piano, it's played very lyrically. It probably doesn't have the ultimate top end power of the others. It has much more than the GS. It's got a good hall presence, but it's, obviously it's a more delicate mouthpiece. Works really well on Geyers that tend to project really well. It works with you. Specifically, like you would, this works really well on European Geyers. So like your Schmids, your Paxmans, your, Yamaha style horns, or, Yamaha makes sort of Geyers in the European tradition to some sense in their newer ones. Those all tend to work really well with the GM. So there you have it. There's kind of the things that you might play on a Kruspe, how they relate to, the G series, and how some of the models within the G series relate to each other.